Welcome to the Grizzled Geologist Podcast. I'm your host, Keith Carden, and this is a podcast that's going to be talking about oil and gas, geology, geophysics, and many subjects in between. This is our first episode, and I am very happy to welcome my first guest, Matt Hatami. He's an engineer and an author, and I'm going to give him a chance to introduce himself here in just one second. But today we're going to be talking about drilling a well on the moon, and not just any well, an actual deep well. So let's get started. Matt, why don't you tell us about yourself?
Thank you, Keith. I'm Matthew Hatami. I'm an engineer with over 20 years of experience. I've worked at Halliburton Company, Hess Corporation, Chesapeake, American Energy Partners, and then more recently working with the team, put a project together, raised private equity capital, drilled wells, operated the asset, and then sold. For the past year, I've been working on my second book, Shale Oil and Gas Operations, Maximize Cash Flow with Cost Reduction. It's written from the CEO's perspective and includes over 700 actions to reduce cost and increase free cash flow during drilling, completions, and production. Thank you, Keith, so much for having me on your show. I look forward to our discussion.
Hey, thank you for coming on, Matt. Really quick before we get started, I'd like to thank this episode's sponsor, New Tech Energy Alliance. I've used New Tech through the years for several different applications, but anytime I needed to do a new exploration play, I leaned on them to handle the petrophysics and give me the volumetrics and economic calculations that I needed to get by. Now they offer regional and field studies across the Permian, Anadarko, and the Appalachian basins. If you're interested in New Tech Energy Alliance and petrophysical logs, please check their website. It's linked in the description. Now, Matt, let's get started. You know, this was very interesting to me when you brought it up. You're the one that was like, I think it would be really interesting to drill a well on the moon, and not just any well, like a deep one. So why don't you just get started and tell us a little bit about how this came to be?
Yeah, I mean, there's a popular opinion that oil and gas is in its later stages of growth and opportunity to create value from a shareholder perspective in terms of there being, limited upside. But I completely disagree for so many reasons. Some of the stuff I wrote about in the book, reducing cost, increasing efficiencies, you combine that with increasing recovery factors, primarily for oil and gas reservoirs, which are currently only 10 to 20%. And you can increase free cash flow significantly and then reinvest the proceeds in high return assets over many years. One of the things I talk about in the book is the principle of 100x, or investing, let's say, $10,000, and then over many years, the investment grows to $1 million, right, through compounding. I think that opportunity exists for many oil and gas companies and is exciting from an investment perspective. The other dynamic is opportunities to expand our business model into new markets. And I think the question everyone listening to this should ask themselves is, are you content selling oil for $60 a barrel? Or is selling water off planet at $3.5 million a barrel interesting? Or helium-3 at $20 million a kilogram? Because those markets exist and those opportunities exist, and it's going to be technologies and things from the oil and gas industry deployed at scale to make it happen. I think initially it's going to be something on the moon that we pursue, and it's going to require drilling, which is areas of expertise that are in the oil and gas industry. So from that perspective, I think there's a business case to be made to drill a deep well on the moon.
Yes. Now, where do you think we sit in terms of the technology today? Do you want to sit and discuss some of the things that you think would work now, and what are the real feasibility of some of this tech on the moon?
Well, so far, the deepest well ever drilled is about 10 feet. And that was done during the Apollo missions. And I think, 10 feet's not bad, but in our industry, those are rookie numbers. And when I'm talking about drilling, it's hundreds of feet, if not thousands. And so, many of the technologies that we use on Earth can be modified to work in space and on the moon. there are a number of things that need to be developed. But I think the real question is how deep are we going to go initially? And we can retrofit some technologies to be able to do that. Of course, getting this stuff to the moon is going to be one of the big factors in terms of cost, because I think one of the reasons why we don't currently have an operation at scale on the moon is because of the cost and the risk, and it's also one of the reasons why we stopped operating there and haven't been back for many years. But from my perspective, I think a lot of things that we do on Earth can be utilized in a similar fashion. So any project that I've worked on across the United States or overseas, one of the first things that I like to do is get a look at the surface, at the area, to see what resources are there and what we can use that's already in place. And I know that might sound unusual on the moon because there really isn't any infrastructure whatsoever. But there might be some things that are that help us from a cost perspective. So obtaining a bunch of very high resolution images from across the moon can help us reduce the cost. For example, there is the potential to utilize lava tubes or structures on the moon that might help us from an operations and risk perspective and cost perspective. But getting some more images on what that looks like, what the diameter is, what can get in there and how we can enter and exit would help us from a cost perspective. And then the other thing is the weight of a lot of our stuff on Earth is very heavy, and it's would be extremely expensive to get it into orbit and to the moon. So we're going to have to look at opportunities to lighten up almost everything that we utilize. And there could be opportunities to utilize stuff that's already on the moon, natural dynamics to supplement stuff that we would otherwise have to bring. So I think, one of the first steps is to get a bunch of very high resolution images from as many locations as possible across the moon to identify the optimal area and what is already there that we could utilize to help reduce the cost.
Yes. And when I think about, a lot of the things that, we would have to do on the moon to actually be able to drill a well, there's going to be different technological changes and some adaptations to our current setups. It's not like we're going to be able to get out there with, 1,000 power top drive diesel generated rigs and just, plunk a triple up on the surface of the moon and start drilling down. You've got, you're going to have closed loop systems. You've got temperature variations, and one of the biggest challenges on the moon, which is the dust. So that's when you talk about things like lava tubes and possibly being able to get, underground, so to speak. That would be some of the things that would need boots on the ground, actual mapping, and the ability to kind of get the layout first. And I would agree, kind of going underground, you're protected from solar radiation, and you would, potentially be able to seal that already kind of pre-built structure, from the outside harsh environment of the moon. And another thing I'd like to kind of touch on briefly is that, yes, getting all of this equipment on, rockets, shooting them to the moon, the first thing that we would want to do is go categorize, map, understand, and put a few holes in the ground so we could understand the mineral resources there as well. There's going to be many opportunities, in addition to helium, and other things, to be able to manufacture and actually mine and get these commodities on the moon. So, that's one of the things that I think the challenges would need to look at, or some of the new tech that would need to get up there first.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think initially the focus will probably be towards identifying commercial quantities of water, which is very similar to operations in the US and overseas. Like, one of the first things that I always look for, regardless of where we're going to drill on Earth, is where is the closest source of water, how much is available, what rate can it be delivered to location. A similar dynamic needs to occur on the moon as well, because even more so because we can utilize water to generate oxygen, hydrogen, fuel, and a bunch of other things, that help us expand our operations. So identifying commercial quantities of water, and hopefully at a certain depth, potentially we encounter liquid water. From a thermal perspective, of course, temperatures on the surface of the moon vary significantly depending on where you are, and regarding like the poles, the equator, the sun. But subsurface, it'll be very interesting to see what we find, and how deep we need to go to see some type of like thermal gradient and potentially find liquid water below surface. I think there's a pretty good chance it's already been identified as water ice being in various locations on the moon. But if we don't need to deal with ice, I think that would help from a cost perspective if we can identify some of this stuff in the subsurface at a reasonable depth, right? Because the deeper we go, the more expensive it's going to be, the more difficult it's going to be. But I think the key is identifying commercial quantities of water and then setting up systems to be able to utilize that water for various processes will help set up an operation at scale where we can go for additional resources, some of which are known today. But I think there's a huge opportunity to discover things that we never thought were there. I mean, I think you would agree, when you're involved in exploration projects, one of the most interesting things and common is that you often discover things that you weren't expecting. And I think the same type of dynamic is going to occur during moon exploration. And it very much has already occurred. If you look back at the initial manned missions to the moon, we weren't looking for any particular resource like helium-3, but we found that. And it was something, very exciting, and it now carries significant value. What will we find when we start drilling much deeper on the moon? I think that could be very exciting. But initially, the business case very easily rests on water, which is at a much higher price in space. On Earth, a gallon goes for a penny. But in space, it's over $80,000 a gallon, to get water to the International Space Station. And the majority of the cost for sustaining life on the ISS is attributed to water. Over 90% of the cost is revolves around getting water and utilizing water to sustain life on the space station. And then the other dynamic, which a lot of companies are focused on, is the helium-3 because of the value potential at over $20 million a kilogram. You can very easily make a business case because everything then comes down to the cost and the risk. And I think within the oil and gas industry, our podcast and some other stuff might be the first time people are hearing about these types of opportunities. So I think it takes time to get people comfortable with the risk and expanding our business model from a focus on just oil and gas on Earth to other opportunities. But if the economics are there, I think people will be interested. But the timing is always an issue. Is now the right time? 5 or 10 years from now? It's very difficult to determine, when people will be more receptive, particularly from an investment perspective, which I think it drives a lot of discussions. If investors are interested, then it's a lot easier to make the case.
Yes. And there's a public sentiment component as well. And that factors in, you could see it with the Apollo program. That was a space race. That was more of a, national decree to go and do something big. And before we jump into the economics, what I wanted to touch base on a little bit more was a little bit of this water scarcity and some of the other things we may look at. And that's exactly right. So do you think that there are potentially, underground reservoirs on the moon that could, hold this water and allow us to capture it and, produce it to be able to build bases? That's the fundamental question of the whole thing. And so while I do think that there's potential for this, I also think that there's potential for actual free gas, some other things that are actual products of the igneous processes that took place on the moon that may actually be things that we need to prepare for and be ready for with this equipment that we've got up there, because safety is going to be a huge concern. One thing fails and you've got a snowball of catastrophes coming after that. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on whether or not you think that there could be some water trapped in reservoirs underground, and After that, I'd like to kind of segue into a little bit more of the economic drivers.
Yeah, I think there's a pretty good chance that there's water in the subsurface based on what has already been found on the surface. Now, whether it's water ice or liquid water or in commercial quantities that we can easily use and what the makeup is of the water, there's uncertainty. There's in general, there's uncertainty as to answering a very simple question in terms of where did the moon come from? Because there's so many theories and they change every few years. Drilling into the subsurface to a significant depth will definitely help us answer that very simple question. Of course, that's not why I'm suggesting doing this. I want to make it very clear. The interest in drilling on the moon is from a business perspective to create value and make money. And that's the only way that this actually works. One of the reasons why we stopped traveling to the moon and currently don't have operations on the moon is because there was not a very strong economic case. And the public lost interest, and therefore we stopped operations. But things have changed, and I think there is a pretty good case today. And there's been a lot of advancements in technology within our industry. A lot of stuff is becoming fully automated, and I think that only helps us with operating on the moon because whatever we can do with robotics without having to send people initially, I think will help from a cost perspective and also from a risk perspective and safety dynamic, as you mentioned earlier. If we don't have people up there initially and we can set up a lot of the initial infrastructure with robotics, I think it'll help from a cost perspective. Of course, there's going to have to be a number of operations that will require a human presence, but that's where the cost can go up. So I think from that perspective, initially, it's a much easier sell from an investment and risk perspective to do as much as we can initially with robotics.
I would agree with that. But there's another part of the moon and this whole kind of spacefaring civilization story that I'd like to touch on really quick. You know, the real benefit of the moon is to provide our species with a place to launch, future space missions from. Getting rid of the atmosphere of the Earth, lowering the gravity by a sixth, or 1/6 the gravity, you've got a much better platform for launching to future space missions, launching satellites. And so there's economic reasons to look at the moon other than just mineral resources, but it is a really big picture that we have to look at. And I don't think it's ever going to be just like one single company. We're going to be having to look at consortiums and groups of people that come together, pool their resources, and work on tackling projects of this magnitude. And so, what do you think are going to be the economic drivers that get us out there first? And again, there's a case to be made. When do we need to get into space? And you and I've visited about this before, but I have a little bit of a catastrophism bone in me. And I've seen, through my geologic experience, the different times in Earth's history where, major cataclysms have wiped off entire species off the planet. And so, there is a point that we have to get to as a civilization that decides when is this that we're going to start spending money on big picture things that are going to turn us into a spacefaring, society. So, what are your thoughts on some of that?
Well, there's a lot of dynamics there that you mentioned, but from a uh, protecting the Earth perspective, I think that some of the same technologies that we would utilize to drill on the moon can be utilized to protect the planet from an environmental disaster. For example, not many people may know this, but our planet is hit with small asteroids on a daily basis. Most of them burn up in the atmosphere, but some of the bigger ones need to be deflected. Something that wiped out the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. If that were to occur today, we don't have a very strong plan in place. But the most effective method to protect our planet from a significant asteroid is to drill a hole in the center of the object as deep as possible and then place nuclear weapons in the hole.
Sounds
Um,
like a movie script a little bit.
yeah, there are many techniques that can work to protect our planet from an asteroid impact, and all of them work to a certain extent, but it depends on how much time you have. So if the asteroid is fairly large and approaching at a high rate of speed, the most effective method is to drill and put nuclear weapons into the hole. And those are two technologies that the oil and gas industry has expertise in terms of drilling and fracturing. And you're not necessarily trying to blow the asteroid apart depending on its size. You're trying to
Just nudge it.
nudge it.
Yep.
Of course, it depends like how big it is, and
Just like in
research
geosteering, 1 degree is a huge difference. One
exactly.
degree you can
Yeah,
come completely out of zone. And same thing here with a trajectory towards Earth. You change it by half a degree and you completely miss. Blast
exactly.
straight
And
to the sun.
the further away that it is, the more that a small nudge makes a pretty big difference in terms of its impact on Earth and the damage that it's going to do.
Yep.
But something as small as 300 feet, depending on its speed and trajectory, its angle, can do quite a bit of damage to our planet. The asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs is believed to be 6 miles, which
Mhm.
is fairly big, and but we have the technology to prevent that from occurring. But we're currently not operating in space to be able to deploy it in a timely manner because a lot of these asteroids, and you see it in the news every so often, they only discover them after they have
Yeah, it's way
passed
too
us. Yeah,
close. Yeah,
wait,
it's way too
like,
close. And so that's
um,
my question. Do you think we're ready now? I mean, so say, tomorrow there's one to just shot out of the Oort cloud or whatever it is out there, and it's
you know,
barreling towards us. Are we ready? Are we ready today as a civilization to act on
I think so because, one of the things to look at that's gained a lot of traction in recent years is the ESG movement,
that?
where oil and gas companies are investing billions of dollars in projects that don't have a direct monetary return. They're done more from an ESG perspective, and I can see no greater action from an ESG perspective than to invest in technologies that could prevent the entire destruction of our planet by deflecting an asteroid.
Yeah.
I mean, what more could you do to protect the environment,
Well,
right?
you could already be on the moon and ready to launch from there.
Yeah,
And
I
so
mean,
there's a case to be made to go ahead and start thinking about this and talking about it. It could be 2 generations, it could be 10 generations for now, but I think that there is a case to be made that money is going to be needing to be deployed into space. And the first stop for us is going to be the moon.
I agree. From an economic perspective, to answer your earlier question, there already is a market for water in space. On a per barrel basis, it's over $3 million. So, you know, if I'm selling oil at $60 a barrel, all of a sudden the ability to sell something at $3 million a barrel sounds interesting to me.
And you can
Yeah,
engineer your way to better costs.
exactly. Like my book is focused on cost reduction because a lot of these projects on Earth initially are look to be uneconomic. And I can't tell you how many meetings I've been in where people that are considered experts with decades of experience looked at a shale play um, that is very attractive today and said it would never work. It was too deep. It was too hot. The Haynesville is a perfect example. Many experts never thought that shale play would work because of the depth and the temperature and the initial cost. The
Yep.
initial wells were very expensive and they were uneconomic initially, but over time, through cost reduction, the cost
And
came way down.
experimentation and new
Yeah,
technology, it's worked.
and it
We
it
had to change the
continues
fracks and all kinds of different
all kinds of stuff, and it continues to this day. I
things.
find it interesting when people with significant experience think that there's no more cost reduction to achieve because That's just not true. There's tremendous opportunity to increase free cash flow by further reducing costs from their current levels. The cost it can always go down. And
Yeah.
it's the same thing with operating on the moon. I know initially people hearing this are going to think that it's not for the oil and gas industry. It's too risky. It's too expensive, and it's
There's
not
going to come a time that it's not.
it's not necessarily our area of expertise. But I completely disagree. If it's not us taking advantage of this opportunity, then who is it? The oil and gas industry is one of the best industries in terms of being able to go to a new area where there's absolutely no civilization, there's no roads, there's no power, there's no water, and setting up an entire town from nothing to create a project that generates cash flow. There's very few other industries that are able to do that. It's just we're changing the location slightly from Earth to the moon.
Just
It's
ever
it's
so
yeah.
slightly.
It's not
A little bit.
it's not that far. And
No.
you look up in the sky, it's there. It's not something so far away like Mars. I think that should not be the focus initially from a business perspective if we're trying to
Right.
make a return on investment. I mean, if we're going around raising billions of dollars from multiple companies to attempt to do this, which is what I think it would require,
Hmm.
investors are going to have to feel comfortable that they're going to get a fairly quick return on investment.
Yep.
And I think you can make that case today, utilizing robotics initially to acquire as much data as possible that creates value right away to be able to see exactly what we're doing, where we would drill, and what we could potentially find. So I don't think it's as far off as it might initially seem. Of course, it's going to take some people within our industry to step up and take some risk. Now, I think by reducing costs 20, 30, 40%, it frees up a lot of potential free cash flow that companies can then decide on what they want to do.
For the
And
future.
for the future. So if you are able to reduce your costs 20 or 30% from whatever they are today, then all of a sudden you have a bunch of free cash flow that you could return to investors through buybacks or dividends. But I think you can make a pretty good case to your primary investors that looking at opportunities on the moon could generate a pretty significant return. If nothing else, from an ESG perspective, I think all investors would benefit from protecting the planet from an asteroid impact or some other dynamic that
Yeah.
you can make a pretty good case for. And
I
that's
agree.
not that's
Oh,
not
I would just say
something.
that's probably going to be one of the closest themes
Yeah.
and the quickest ways to get there. It's hard. People are excited about space and going to the moon, but investors are usually pretty savvy and they understand what a rate of return is. And so I think that going through ESG, government, and basically social and species support would get us up there the quickest.
Sure. I mean, the economic case must be there. So, very similar to supplying energy on the Earth, if we were able to establish water and fuel stations at various locations on the moon, I think you would have customers uh, very much interested
Yeah.
in purchasing your products.
And if you
So,
build it, they will come. And this is
yeah.
one of those cases that if you got infrastructure, you're going to have a whole new network of people trying to get up to use it.
Absolutely. A water well on the moon changes uh, the entire dynamic and opportunity for, our entire civilization. So it's easier said than done, but the technology does exist, and I think it's possible. It just depends on the depth. How deep are we going to have to drill to find something of commercial value? Maybe it's right on the surface,
Well,
but
the only thing I was going to say is we're probably going to have to do it like the old schoolers did. We're just going to have to drill till we find it, dude. So, and that's the God honest truth. I really do think this is a great idea. I love this topic, but we're getting pretty close on time. Do you have any kind of final thoughts to wrap up this first episode?
What I would say is, however low you think your costs currently are, they can always go much lower than you think, which provides a lot of opportunities to create significant value. So never think that your costs, regardless of whether you're drilling on the Earth or interested in potentially doing something on the moon, cannot be further reduced, because there's a lot of innovative opportunities if you have an open mind.
Yep, I 100% agree. Well, Matthew, thank you so much for coming on the show with me. Thank you for giving me the idea.
Thank you, Keith. I enjoyed it. Look forward to our next discussion.
Thank you so much. And to everybody else, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and make sure you hit the notification bell. Thank you so much. And to all you space cadets out there, stay safe.
You have to work for it. Don't be crazy. And work for your money.